Welcome back to the Buckeye Breakdown podcast, where the Ohio State Buckeyes are getting ready for the 2021 season. BuckeyesNow on Sports Illustrated is your spot to get ready for that season and follow those Buckeyes all season long. Alongside Brett Hiltbrand, I'm Brendan Gulick. Glad to have you tonight, Brett, for a day that had some what felt like fairly important news, and then simultaneously also felt head-scratching. I think we got a nice hand-holding, a nice group of three, Power 5 conference commissioners saying, hey, whatever happens, we're going to do this together. Now let's figure out what that is, because I think there was like a lot of this, really lofty rhetoric and, talking in circles without having a clear exact path forward. But the general consensus to me was we'll figure it out and we're going to try to figure it out together. How'd you interpret it?
Worst episode of Survivor ever is how I would maybe describe the situation we saw today. And it was it might have been like the PR Speak Olympics, and I'm not sure anybody medaled today. I really, on a personal level, I struggle with like corporate speak, and I'm a patient guy by nature. I have no patience for corporate speak, very, very little. And I think we are in this era of, big money college sports in these conferences, wielding so much power and, almost being multinational corporations and millions and millions and millions of dollars behind it. They are very much corporations now, for sure. And so it feels weird that we're here at this point, that we even have to kind of discuss this. And I think in large part, I'm still shocked that in a lot of ways, Texas still has the power it does, and is maybe, kind of a domino in this kind of cascading mess that we are currently, finding ourselves in. But whatever today was, it was certainly something.
We can talk about Texas and Oklahoma here in a little bit. I want to at least try to start with our focus on today. I think the biggest takeaways, newsworthy takeaways, one, all three commissioners basically came straight out and said, look, we don't want to interfere with already scheduled, games down the line, right? So the Ohio State Notre Dame series that's going to take place in 22 and 23, execute that. And oh, by the way, all of the, the games against your non-Power 5 schools, same thing. So on one level, you sit there and go, well, gee, when and how is this alliance going to start taking place from a football perspective? Because the Buckeyes don't have an open date till 2024. I think I saw earlier today, Penn State doesn't have an open date till 25. So, the general consensus seemed to be, we're going to try to schedule games amongst ourselves, but we're not going to prevent you from scheduling games against teams in other conferences. And Jim Phillips came out today and said the Big 12 is really important. It's critical to college athletics. It's critical to the Power 5. But they weren't a part of this alliance. And who knows if the Big 12 is still going to exist in its, current or future iteration in the next year or two, right? There's already a contract in place that Texas and Oklahoma are going to have to get out of. But who knows how the current structure of that league even remains, and perhaps they don't even remain at all. Perhaps the league dissolves. Maybe all the teams end up going elsewhere. I mean, those are very realistic possibilities. So I think there's an element of this alliance without these three commissioners coming straight out and saying it. There's a lot going on in college athletics, and they kept going back to that point. And they specifically pointed out, the NCAA's constitution may be changing, and how they legislate or govern should be changing. Name, image, and likeness, and the transfer portal, and on and on and on and on. And very sparingly did they talk about conference realignment or talk about the specifics of Texas and OU going to the SEC. But there's a reason why this discussion started when Texas and OU had it made public a month ago that they were headed to the SEC. I think the best way for fans to digest all of this is to accept the fact that in all likelihood, these three leagues are looking at each other saying, we've got big TV contracts with TV partners. Even the ACC's deal isn't very good, but at least they have a deal with a huge media outlet in ESPN. And it's my gut feeling that they are trying to stabilize some of the, quickly changing landscape in college sports and prevent the SEC from doing whatever the hell they want to do. Like saying, hey, let's have 100 scholarships because we want to do that now. We're going to go do it. Right now, there's maybe some sort of like aligned thinking group that could vote against something like that. So I think that could be the best accomplishment from today. But somewhere along the way, Brett, I mean, don't you have the right to serve your own needs as a commissioner? Kevin Warren better look out for the Big Ten. George Kliavkoff better look out for the Pac-12, right? I mean, there's some level of that you can't ignore.
I think Kevin Warren maybe said it best when he said there's turbulence in college athletics. And we're like, yeah, man, you're the one maybe churning it a little bit. I think in a lot of ways, as fans and for us, doing this as a job, like I think, name, image, and likeness, signaled certainly a new era of collegiate athletics. And I think I was ready for that. And I think I was, I think that was a fairly easy thing as far as anticipating that coming. And even some conference realignment, I felt like, that happens, right? That happens periodically. We've seen some seismic shifts before. But I think we are approaching territory, if not already in it at this point, of major, like cataclysmic, seismic type transition here in what collegiate athletics looks like, what collegiate athletes look like, as far as forward-facing, front-facing public people. And I think as a byproduct of those two things, how fans essentially consume all of this, and all of these changes will change. And so we are most definitely in this period of transition. And I think because we're in that, we feel a little bit untethered from the past. And I think that's one of the kind of the pillars that makes collegiate athletics special, right? Is its reverence and constant comparison and juxtaposition with seasons past, coaches past, conferences past, whatever.
Amen.
And the idea that fandom a lot of times, is patrilineal or through family lines, right? Like or its geographic significance, and in ways that pro sports just doesn't quite offer on the same level.
And there's a romance, there's a regionalism to it that like makes that engine go.
And a sense of ownership too, right? Sure. Like you can go to Ohio State and feel like you own in so much as the word or are part of this kind of glacial, entity that reflects, in some people, reflects directly upon themselves, right? And like the success or failures of a certain college team, are directly related to, its alumni, right? And how those people kind of feel about themselves, and also maybe their university and communities at large. So we're in a period of change. It's going to feel very turbulent. It's going to feel very weird. I think in a lot of ways you can maybe make like a really solid Star Wars reference here as far as like Rebel Alliance and the Death Star. And I think we all know who the Death Star is and who the Empire might be. And we have these, kind of conferences kind of banding together a little bit to try and kind of fight off the impending doom that the southeastern part of the country seems to, be really intent on kind of forcing upon the rest of the country.
We'll take your questions or your comments here as we go along. If you're watching either on our YouTube channel, which we certainly hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel if you are. If you're listening after the fact, you can certainly listen live as we broadcast this live, but you can find your Buckeye Breakdown podcast wherever you like to find it. But please feel free to interact with the show if if you're watching live with us. A comment here: I wouldn't mind seeing this scheduling alliance come to fruition, but without an actual contract and many years till new scheduling is actually in play, who knows what will happen. I think that brings up maybe the funniest point of all of this, or at least the point where fans kind of go, there was a direct question asked today of what kind of legally binding document has been signed, will be signed, etc., to enforce this alliance or whatever name you're calling it, because people right now are being left to call it whatever they want to call it. And George Kliavkoff jumped right in, and I admire his straightforwardness in his answer. I guess I don't know if I love what he said, but he came straight out and said there is no legally binding document. We don't feel like we need to have some sort of contract. This is essentially a gentleman's agreement, for lack of a better way to explain it. A group of like-minded thinkers, university presidents, athletic directors, boards of trustees, and certainly commissioners that all want to try to achieve the same thing. And, we're working together to try to achieve that, but never did they think that they needed to sign some sort of legally binding agreement. Maybe that's because they weren't sure if they could come up with something that would work for all parties, and they want to leave it open-ended. I guess I can see that component to it. And Brett, there definitely here has to be an element of trust between some of these, schools or some of these commissioners, if they want to work what they seem to be setting out to do. I just keep thinking to myself that, this is a really tough environment right now where it's hard to be trustworthy when you don't know if your best interests are going to be met. And maybe you do choose to trust somebody and you get burned, then what? So, there's no legally binding anything for this quote unquote alliance. And I'd like to think that everybody wants to be good and true to their word. I don't know.
Yeah, I think of in my mind, the way I'm kind of looking at this initially is what are the most valuable pieces of property, and I'm air quoting property, that these conferences have in terms of what exists, what contests and in sports exist under kind of their under their purview that are the most appealing, right? We're talking about Big Ten football for sure. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Ohio State football. We're talking about ACC basketball, men's basketball, and women's basketball, and Clemson football. And then in the Pac-12, what exactly?
I guess USC,
right, like
big market, big tradition. But.
Yeah, lots of eyeballs, certainly lots of TV eyeballs, but we're not necessarily talking about, exceptional football programs that have made a lot of noise in the last 10 years. And certainly I think there's, you can maybe make the case that Pac-12 basketball, men's and women's basketball is making an impact. I think Stanford's women certainly are kind of included in that. If you look at the women's basketball properties too, I mean, look at the ratings of the women's Final Four. It's been up like exponentially over the last couple of years. And I think that's in large part to the games being really, really good, but also just the increased exposure that they're getting. The fact that the games are more primetime, the slots better and on ESPN. So I wonder a little bit about leverage and which conference or which group maybe has the most leverage, and then as an extension of that, who has the most to gain and the most to lose. Well, and I think that's where this, like, there's a lot of questions here, right? Because in my mind, I'm looking at the Big Ten and wondering like, well, it's like, man, I understand that you might there's kind of an isolation kind of, but and maybe there's strength in numbers and all of this, but man, you have to wonder a little bit about like, is this a super conference? That's coming, down the line? What does this look like for, non-conference matchups, conference seasons, whatever? So I think we inevitably with all of this, and this is why I think the whole thing feels a little weird, is we came away from this situation answering a question that no one was really asking, one. And two, we have a lot more follow-ups and a lot more questions, I think, today than we did the day before. And I'm not so sure that's a good thing as well.
I think the Big Ten has to be the league that is, front and center in this discussion, because they're the only league in the country that can actually compete with the SEC on a balance sheet, right? It's the oldest. It might not feel like it right now if you're living in SEC country. Maybe you've got SEC glasses on and you think that, everything starts and stops with that league. The Big Ten is the oldest and wealthiest conference in America. And the fact of the matter is, to your point, in this alliance, far and away, the two biggest sports properties are Ohio State and Michigan. They are two of the four biggest athletic departments in the country, other than Texas and Texas A&M. Those numbers are pre-COVID, but even through the coronavirus pandemic, Ohio State and Michigan financially did not have to make the same, quite the same level of what's the right word? Yeah, I mean, everybody had furloughs and things like that, but it didn't impact the Buckeyes as severely as Purdue and Nebraska and some of these programs that have, spent money like drunken sailors, where the Buckeyes, for lack of a better way to say it, were sort of saving for a rainy day, right? They didn't cut programs. They didn't fire coaches. They maintained as much a sense of normalcy as they could afford to, because they were preparing for a drastic event, which was a fiscally responsible thing to do. I just think that with the Big Ten's media rights coming to market next, with the two biggest properties of these 41, total that are a part of, this quote unquote alliance, I have a hard time seeing a circumstance where the Big Ten at least doesn't kind of sort of get their way. But to your point, for something like this to work, man, it's got to work for everybody somehow. And, the Pac-12, they came straight out and said, we are very for playoff expansion. Well, no kidding. Things haven't been very good right now for the Pac-12 and the college football playoff. Of course, they're for expansion. Kevin Warren has said the same thing. He is pro expansion of the playoff, but under a circumstance where they don't cut corners in evaluating their options. I think that's a responsible thing to say. The ACC didn't really come straight out and say what their thoughts were, or at least the commissioner didn't, around college football playoff expansion. I still think there's a reasonable likelihood that the playoff expands, but I'm not so sure that it's going to be as cut and dry as it was a month ago before this news came out.
Right. And I, in my mind, if we're kind of extrapolating, and if you'll forgive me a couple moments of wild speculation, but I like my jump right into like revenue sharing, right? Like if you're the ACC, you will absolutely take the crumbs that fall off the Big Ten's table, right? If you're the Pac-12, you're gobbling up everything you possibly can that comes both directly and tangentially to you through kind of the lens of, what the Big Ten brings, right? And so maybe that's what feels so odd in a lot of ways. But I mean, at the same time, I think if you're these conferences and very, very well, and you know exactly where kind of every school stands in the hierarchy, the totem pole, so to speak, and you know what your most valuable assets are, and you know where what your least valuable assets are. I think when you look at what the SEC has done with both Texas and Oklahoma and what that might look like, you absolutely worry about, your most valuable assets getting poached somewhere else. And so I think it's a strength in numbers situation in a lot of ways. I think that it's maybe a little coattail riding as far as, the ACC and the Pac-12 is concerned a little bit. I think if you wonder, like, what does the ACC look like if Clemson bounces?
If Clemson and Florida State left the ACC, I think in a lot of ways they might be in a similar position. It might not be quite as drastic, but they'd be in a pretty similar position to where the Big 12 is right now. You lose your two biggest dogs, you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, and
real quick, Brett, to your earlier point, does that mean that as these conferences start to decide what pieces of the pie go to which schools, is it an even split for everybody, or do Clemson and Florida State maybe get a little better percentage than Duke or Virginia Tech? Maybe Duke's a bad example because basketball's so good, but Virginia Tech or Boston College, right? Maybe should Ohio State and Michigan get a better percentage of the media rights, acquired by the Big Ten than Minnesota and Northwestern? I think those are fair things to consider.
And also that's where the idea of, the independence amongst schools, and where, all of a sudden they, some of these universities and athletic departments realize where the majority of their leverage is or is not, right? If it exists or it doesn't. And how, when do they feel like they work to exercise some of that? And is there a tiered kind of revenue sharing, all that kind of stuff? I think, if we're even like going to take even like a broader view of this, almost on like a kind of a societal standpoint, I do think there is a bubble, so to speak, of live media rights, live sports, live TV sports rights, where the money is going to run out eventually, and that's a fact. It'll happen at some point.
Yeah, there's no way so much to go around, really.
Right. There's no way the NFL is worth as much as it says it is, to its broadcasters. There's no way the PGA Tour is worth as much as it was with selling their most recent media rights. Right. There's no way Major League Baseball is worth what it is, the NBA. But because each one has been able to ask for more and then essentially get it, because that's the only way these cable providers and streaming agencies can make any money, because that's really the only way to guarantee eyeballs for ad rates. Essentially the demand meets the supply there a little. And so when that kind of comes crashing down at some point, and it will, I just don't know when, I think in a lot of ways that shapes this specific conversation in a really dramatic way. Because I think if we're distilling this down to its purest form, this is a conversation we're having about two main things, right? We're talking about NCAA governance and leverage of that based upon conference strength. And then we're talking about live TV rights specific to each individual conference, and essentially who makes the most money by getting the most eyeballs. Those I think are the two factors.
There's a reason here where the Pac-12 and the Big Ten could have an alliance and say, hey, it's really good for TV media rights and for eyeballs and advertisers to have the Buckeyes playing against USC, one of the biggest brands in college football, against maybe a team that, has a ton of tradition. USC is not necessarily playing on the same, playing field right now that Ohio State is, but huge market. When they're good, they've got a great following. LA's kind of a pro sports town. And I think their college teams, the fan bases can be a little finicky at times. They're good, but you got a lot of choices in town, and sometimes it's hard to see fans. I've asked Brian Driscoll this at the Notre Dame Sports Illustrated site, Irish Breakdown. He's told me straight out, when Notre Dame has played at USC, there have been some games where they've played in front of pretty bad crowds. because people haven't always wanted to just go out and support USC. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you've got a big brand like Ohio State and you've got maybe a sleeping giant in, a program like USC, those kinds of matchups could be really good for college athletics. They could be really good for college football. The money could be there. There's reasons to encourage big programs to play big programs. But for, I don't know, Oregon State to now schedule Virginia Tech, is that really making a huge impact on eyeballs and advertisers and the finances behind college football? Like, I'm not really buying that.
If we're talking specifically about the Pac-12, I can make the argument that Oregon is actually the Pac-12's most valuable asset. It's not SC, it's not UCLA, it's not Stanford, it's not Washington. It's Nike University in Oregon, and what could potentially happen there with name and likeness opportunities specific to Nike, and what that might mean for Oregon football, basketball, and other sports kind of tangentially in a trickle-down way with recruiting. And then as a step beyond that, on-field success. I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how the whole landscape of college athletics is changing, and it's very important in this kind of time of transition and change that you don't lose what made college sports what it is, right? And I think one of the big pieces is that reverence and constant kind of awareness of the past traditions, right? And if there is, and I think in a big way, traditions a lot of times stem from consistency amongst opponents. And I think if you lose some of those traditional regional rivalries, that's a problem. And I think as an extension of that, I think you lose a little bit of interest in geographical or whatever, regional or whatever. So, I think if you were to ask the average Wisconsin fan who they would rather play, would you rather play, Purdue, or would you rather play Pitt? They're going to say Purdue overwhelmingly more. And maybe that's a resistance to change kind of thing, and is a factor there. But I think the traditions matter. And I think the traditions matter a lot more than I think we realize, right? Like, I'm a child of the 90s. Maybe nostalgia for the 90s amongst, people my age is massive in ways that I think people a little bit older than us don't feel. Right. And I think if you take away some of that, I think that I could see being a problem. Right. So there are so many kind of little bits of influence that I think really, really move and kind of hit this kind of situation from all sides that is going to make this whole thing complicated. It is already extremely complicated, but I'm an internal optimist, and I'm always kind of interested as to like kind of what comes around the corner with some of the growth and transition and change. But there is a part of me that worries about this as far as it getting too big. There's too much money. And then it's just a dollars arms race, more than it already is now in a lot of ways, or exponentially more than it is now. And we lose some of the soul that makes college athletics maybe the best.
I think the biggest word that you said that resonated with me was consistency. The idea that, it's not just one-offs where you're playing against a team that's quote unquote a regional rival. It's the fact that you look forward to those games every year or darn near every year.
Right.
That's part of what makes college football so special. I totally agree. And hopefully it is the goal. I believe it to be the goal of this alliance to try to maintain those kinds of things. So I hope that exists. There's two more things I want to talk about. One of them is Texas and OU based, because it feels as though this has all started because of the move they made. And I got to thinking earlier about what it must be like right now to be Lincoln Riley and to be Steve Sarkisian, coaching for giant college football programs in a conference where you've become absolutely loathed, hated. They're going to get booed every time they go on the road. They can't leave the Big 12 fast enough.
Yeah.
But who knows how soon they're actually going to be able to get out and get in with the SEC. The challenges that those two schools must be going through in recruiting, because your recruiting pitch to kids is, hey, come play for us. We're going to be an SEC school. Well, when's that going to happen? Well, I don't know. Could be next year, could be 4 years, could be 3 years. Until it's done, it's not done, and you don't know for sure. And how challenging it might be to recruit to those programs under these really weird, tough circumstances. And yet Oklahoma seems to continue to recruit, some pretty high-level kids. Texas just kind of feels fickle to me, man. Like, they want to win for sure, and they seem to have a pretty short leash. If they're not winning, then on to the next guy. I wonder how long Chris Del Conte will have Steve Sarkisian's back. Tom Herman is a really, really good football coach, and I'm a little surprised that it didn't last as long as it probably could have. There's a lot of schools in the country that would kill to be Texas. So I don't know. I kind of got thinking earlier about the weird world that those programs must be living in, because they can't get to the SEC fast enough, but they truly don't have an answer. And who knows when we're going to find out, because the Big 12 owns their media rights till 25. So it could be a couple years. Who knows?
I'm gonna kind of expand off your question by asking you a question.
Okay.
How many schools, universities across our country do you think have a larger endowment, a more wealthy endowment than the University of Texas?
If there's any, you can count them on one hand. I'm sure of it.
It's one. Do you know what school it is?
My three guesses would be Ohio State, Texas A&M, and Michigan.
It's Harvard, and that's in large part. That's in large part for a couple reasons. One, that they're just overall giving. If you kind of actually think about like Harvard alums, like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay.
But also their overall asset management and some of the I'll use the word investments that university has made over 200 plus years have paid off handsomely. There's one school that has more money, so to speak, than the University of Texas. There's one, and within the University of Texas and its $39-point-something billion endowment is a huge amount of land assets, real estate assets, and mineral rights. And I don't think any of those things are depreciating in value.
No.
So they quite literally, not quite literally, but figuratively print money year in and year out. And it is mystifying to me that a middling athletic department that has had basically no outright success athletically in really any sport over the last 15, 16 years. Freshman
they've had a couple flashes in the pan, but nothing.
Well, Vince Young was when?
2005.
2005. So my freshman year of college, 2005 was the last time their football team was technically relevant. And yet they wield this much power. And it is all due to the fact that the war chest is as big as it is. Oklahoma is not that far down the list. So is Texas A&M. Not that far down as far as both endowments and then what they have as far as assets and liquidity from the both the net worth of the athletic departments themselves, but then also the overall financial power that the universities hold, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of geographical reasons. Cough, cough, energy, cough, cough. That Oklahoma and Texas wield the power that they do. And I think it would be naive of us to say that what we're seeing now is at best influenced by, I think it is a direct marker and movement, a strategic move because of everything that those two schools are able to do in conjunction with the SEC, who's more than happy to be able to take the blank checks that both of those schools will be cutting to be able to join the league. So, but at the same time, you also have to wonder a little bit about, I think what you said about Sark and Lincoln Riley is fantastically fascinating to me, in that these two football coaches, whether we like it or not, and whether we think this is right or not, and you can make the I would be open to any and all arguments and discussions about that specifically, or about this specifically, that they influence that $39.1 billion endowment more than maybe anyone else. Football coach does.
Yeah.
Not Jerry Jones, not the governor of Texas, not Garth Brooks, even though Garth Brooks, I think, is an Oklahoma State guy. But you know what I'm saying? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. But that, I think, is the world that we live in. And in a lot of ways, I think that's a lot of pressure for someone, especially when you're relying on other people to kind of go and do your work, so to speak.
That would be a really interesting podcast to have. What college football coach has the most pressure? Who is on the eternal hot seat? And is it just the programs that are at the top of the food chain because they're expected to stay there, or are there other mitigating factors at other universities where maybe coaches aren't comfortable? That would be a fascinating discussion. We should do that. Yeah,
I agree. I would put Texas number one every time in that conversation.
It's a good thought. It's a good thought.
Yeah, but I think that's like such an interesting kind of little kind of corner, if you will, of this overall conversation that we're having, right? Is that these two schools, in a lot of ways, are kind of standing at the bully pulpit and using the leverage that they do have to influence the whole kind of spectrum. And I think that's fascinating. I don't know if I think that's right.
It's a great point.
But right is subjective. But that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Hard pivot, I guess, to the last idea here, and just how does this all affect the Buckeyes? And while I let you stew on that for a minute, for people that don't maybe have memorized Ohio State's future non-conference opponents, next year the Buckeyes are playing Notre Dame, Arkansas State, and Toledo. 23, San Jose State, Western Kentucky, and Notre Dame's the big game. 2024, there's only two non-conference games scheduled so far, Southern Miss and Washington. 25 will be interesting, Texas, Washington, both in the same year, and UConn. 26 is Ball State, Texas, and Boston College. 2027, Bowling Green, Alabama, Boston College. And then after that, there's only one team on the schedule there the rest of the way, Alabama in 28, Georgia 30-31, and Oregon 32-33. So the Buckeyes do have some, pretty notable non-conference games coming up here in the next decade. Several of them are Pac-12 or ACC schools. Ohio State has never really shied away from scheduling tough games. I think the SEC, you have more of that. Hey, let's schedule the additional game against fill in the blank FCS school. Everybody wants to watch Alabama play Mercer. I guess if you can do it, you can do it, right?
Bless those kids.
The sacrificial lambs at Mercer.
Savannah State, them too. Yeah.
Yep. Same deal. So, again, how does this all impact the Buckeyes? Look, you've got a conference that you are still king of in football. You are one of two schools that financially is way out in front of the rest of the league. And again, maybe this is because the Buckeyes are in a great spot. I have a really difficult time seeing things happen in this quote unquote alliance that would go, greatly against the wishes of, or the best intentions of the Buckeyes.
Winning cures all ills.
Sure does.
And I think that is in a lot of ways the only requirement right now for this program during this transition. Just keep winning. Because if you fall by the wayside in, say, ways that we've seen Texas is a good example of that, or Florida State, that have had some success and then some bad seasons in a row, and then all of a sudden you kind of fall out of the zeitgeist amongst modern recruiting. And it's very, very, very hard to scratch and claw your way back into that top tier. If you do that, then it's a problem, because then you lose your leverage. I think overall, the landscape of college football, you lose your leverage. But I don't really see that happening. I think the Big Ten football specific is, I would say properly rated as far as strength in football, criminally underrated as far as strength in men's basketball. And those drive the overall conversation. And so I would say, if you're worried about kind of Ohio State losing its foot and toehold in kind of, being basically one of like the top three kind of schools athletically, I don't see that happening. As far as we're talking about Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama, I just don't see that happening. I don't see that happening for a lot of reasons. I think maybe the biggest is Ryan Day. And stability there, I think, is a massive factor. But my biggest concern is what we talked about a few minutes ago, and that's the regional rivalries and the consistency of them. And if you lose those, you lose a little bit of the heart and soul of what makes Ohio State athletics special. And one of the few common denominators that I think we as a society have left. And that, I think, is a greater factor or larger factor in a more maybe more serious conversation about maybe kind of the state of affairs of our country. If you take some of those away, I think we lose a little bit of the fabric of our society. And I think that's a problem, especially if you're doing that because you're chasing dollars elsewhere. And so I would very much caution the powers that be to be aware of that, to have the emotional intelligence and the humility required, the self-awareness required to be able to look at those situations, to be able to analyze how their decisions not only affect universities, but the people who love them and the people who support them, night in and night out, year in and year out. And I think that's important, and perhaps maybe the most important thing we're talking about.
I think that it was mentioned a few times today. I just hope that remains at the front and center of the conversation of this alliance. There's a lot of things pulling, thought processes and decisions these days, and it's all good and nice to sit here and say that we're going to put the health and safety and best interests of our student athletes always at the front of the line. I believe for the most part that has been the case even in this recent past here. But boy, I sure hope that isn't lost in some of these future decisions, because man, we are at a crux in college athletics where we are desperate for passionate, well-intentioned leadership. Well, I was going to say leadership. I mean, college athletics needs leadership in just the worst way. And
absolutely.
I believe there are some good people in college athletics. I've met a lot of good well-intentioned people in leadership roles, you got to make tough decisions. And, sometimes those are popular, sometimes they aren't. But, man, there is a chance right now to shape college athletics for literally decades with all the different things that are going on. I think that's what this alliance is trying to accomplish. If you're a Buckeye fan, I think in a lot of ways you don't need to lose too much sleep, because it's kind of the blessing of being at the top of the food chain. Your football team's good. Your athletic department's healthy. You've got a great coach. You've got a really dynamic athletic director. You play in a conference that, right now you are the king of the castle. There's just a lot of reasons why Ohio State's in a good spot here. And so, it's time for this alliance to try to make some good decisions. And
don't screw it up.
Please don't screw it up. I want to keep loving college football 30 years from now, because it still looks like what it did in some regard, 50 years ago. There are parts of it that need to change, of course, but it's part of the fun of the history of following college football, is that you have the ability to cross-compare certain generations, because there are some core principles that haven't changed. Right. And I really hope that remains.
And you lose that, you lose a little bit of the fabric of what makes it special and important.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, plenty more over at BuckeyesNow.com. We appreciate you hanging out with us here for a little bit tonight. Latest episode of Buckeye Breakdown available wherever you'd like your podcasts. It's in the Apple Store. It's on Spotify. We'll be in the Google Play Store here very shortly. Lots of good things going on with that. And please, if you're not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, we would appreciate that as well. For Brett Hiltbrand, I'm Brendan Gulick. We'll see you again real soon. Buckeyes Now on Sports Illustrated.